The development of effective teaching material to support online learning is an evolving craft. Everyone's a relative novice, so we should all be willing to make mistakes, but when we get it right, it's definitely worth celebrating. So here are 8 tips to consider as you prepare materials in the context in which you're delivering them. You may want to search for other resources on specific media such as PowerPoint and podcasts and so on, but this is a useful introduction. Reviewing the session outcomes before you do anything. Well, your time and that of your students is precious, so make sure the time that you share online is well spent. It can be tempting to fill time around a topic of personal interest, but you should ensure that everything the student is doing whilst online is supporting their learning. This means you're likely to consistently revise your presentations and your lesson plans for online delivery as you learn what generates that maximum level of engagement. Use active language in all materials and their instructions. So try and use active language in all the materials that you share online. Ask questions of things that you share visually. When you post a graph online, for example, why not pause and ask a reflective, a rhetorical question, rather than just share the graph and say, you can see here that there are significant increases in areas where previously, and so on. You might want to ask a question, a direct question. Explore this graph and take a minute to reflect on why those areas in which crime has increased over the decade. Consider what factors might impact on these trends. I'll give you some time to think about that. Then you need to make sure that you do actually give enough time for students to reflect on what they're seeing without leaving them hanging. Normally 10 or 15 seconds is enough to engage the brain. It brings the student's attention where you need it to be. But don't be too quick to answer your own questions, as this can create frustration in your own audience. I often have a stopwatch alongside me just to check. You might ask students to respond to a graph with a poll, chat responses, or possibly by offering the microphone for one of them to speak. Be present. Smile, you're on television. Well, not quite, but the online webinar is more akin to television than radio. After all, this is a rich visual environment. Because of this, you can afford to use the teaching pause effectively, time when you don't speak. This is particularly true if you are visually available to the students, and I advise you to have a small webcam of yourself available throughout the teaching session. This can be paused for reflective pauses, and it can also be removed if the group has some connectivity issues. But in principle, your visual presence makes a significant difference to the level of engagement. By pre-preparing different canvases, you can very quickly change the position or size of the webcam. Make sure that the camera that you're using is at head height so that you are properly framed in the image. There's nothing as disconcerting as looking up someone's nose or seeing one side of their face. But above all, you must ensure that your voice is clear. Always do a microphone setup before every session and sacrifice the webcam over quality of voice every time. Use succinct yet powerful visualizations. Keep it as simple as it can be. Don't include anything extraneous in your graph or image. Provide only the information required to achieve your learning intention. Don't be seduced by the clever representations of information. Keep it simple. Don't use images that are too clever. Whilst you might enjoy the idea of a visual metaphor, it might need an explanation, and that's all unnecessary cognitive load for the student. So use images associated with words instead of words on their own wherever possible. There's a lot of literature about the best way to do this, so explore the resources in this unit for more on this aspect of visual design. Test, test, and test any uploaded media. Always take time to upload your embedded material to the webinar or VLE environment and to check that they are accessible from a different machine to that you use to upload them. Ideally, you should check that they're also available on a tablet as well as just a desktop machine. If you're working in AdobeConnect, it's also a good idea to preload the pods that include shared documents. Remember that video media needs to be uploaded to Connect itself to play back with audio. This may not be the case with shared desktops, so if in doubt you should redirect your students to a web-based resource that they load on their own local machine. Share the raw documents online. If you don't want students to have access to the visuals you use prior to the session, be prepared to share the files online at the end of your session. Just preload an AdobeConnect pod with files uploaded and share at the end of the session. It's also good practice to share these within the VLE after the session's completed. You should give serious thought as to whether materials could be shared prior to the teaching event itself. The ability to familiarise themselves with visual media will aid comprehension. This is particularly for students with learning difficulties and international students, where there is a great cognitive load in deconstructing the information they contain. Mix it up. Don't just rely on PowerPoint to structure your learning message. Use the flexibility of AdobeConnect or the VLE environment to embed PDFs, embed images, video, to share your desktop, and to run polls, for example. Have some variety. Be prepared to be spontaneous. I think it was Mark Twain who said that some of the best spontaneous remarks he'd ever made were those that he'd prepared for. So plan to engage students with spontaneous polls and prepare your online polls in advance. It's much easier to edit an existing poll on the hoof rather than to prepare something from scratch. So once you're very comfortable with the tools, you'll find that you can develop the confidence to generate polls as and when required. But from now, just be prepared.